This morning we are going to be in John chapter 18 and 19. John chapter 18 and 19. If you have a Bible, I would encourage you to take it and turn with us there. If you're using one of the black Bibles that's underneath the chair in front of you, it'll be page 904 and I think 905. And if you don't have one of those, there's on the one on the center table in the back. That's 904 and 905. This morning we can continue this incredible study of the Gospel of John. And John 18 continues this look at the undeniable resolve of the King who has come to redeem his people. The resolve of the King who has set his eyes towards the cross, set his heart's attention on the love of his disciples, set his gaze on the love of all those who would come to know him through the word that has been spoken, through the word that will spread after his resurrection, after the day of Pentecost, through the days and months and the years as the Spirit works through the life of the disciples. We see that as we have remembered what is said, and as we could go back and read what is said in John chapter 17, he prays for those who will come after, that they will be like the Father and the Spirit sharing the same love, the unified like that in the Trinity. The resolve of the King who has given up all to come to fulfill the promises of the Father for all eternity. Remember, this is not a limited scope here, but this is Christ who has come resolved to go to the cross to fulfill the promises that have been made since Genesis 3:15 when the Father spoke to Adam and Eve. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman in Genesis 3:15, and between your offspring and her offspring, and he being Christ shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. And he made this same promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 when he says, I will make of you a great nation. Remember in Genesis chapter 12 when he makes this promise, Abraham had no children. He says, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, get this, he says this in Genesis chapter 12, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. In Genesis chapter 12, we see the promise of the Christ coming, because through him will come from the line of Abraham, who will bless all families, who will bless all nations. It will come from him. And we see the promise of the Christ. The work of the King, the work of the cross is not an arbitrary work. It's not plan B. It was not contrived as another way, but rather it is the plan of redemption for the people, for the purpose of redemption of the children of God. Paul puts it like this. In Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, Paul writes to the church in Rome, he says this, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all have sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come, But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace that the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for the many. And the free gift is not the result of the one man's sin, for the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation. That's where we all stood before Christ. But the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. For if, because of one man's trespasses, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in the life of the one man Christ. So what Paul is saying here is because of one man's trespass, we all die. And because of one man's life, if we are adopted, we all receive grace, and grace that abounds freely and abundantly for all. He says righteousness reigns in the life of the one man, Jesus Christ. And so therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification for all men. That's hope for all of us. That's hope for everything here. So friends, as we study together this gospel narrative, I hope and I pray that we have truly been reminded in our daily lives that not one person has come, not of one man, not just a man has come, not just a person has come, but a king has come. John 1. The Word became flesh and has dwelt among us. We talked about this a few weeks ago. What we see here, what the writer of John says is Jesus, God, showed up in the neighborhood and He moved in and He dwelt and became our neighbor and He lived with us. What we see here is the King who has come full of splendor, full of glory, full of resolve. Full of resolve for the purpose of love to bring redemption to us in the midst of our brokenness. Friends, the truth is for all of us is that we are sinners, all of us, without exception, where we might think that perhaps we do not have much in common. Because we look across this room this morning and we all have different backgrounds. We all have different life stories. We come from different parts of the country. We grew up with different teachings. We grew up with different styles of life. We grew up with different monetary backgrounds, with different financial statuses. We grew up doing different things. We grew up perhaps going to different schools. We grew up and have had different jobs. Some of us have fought in wars. Some of us have not fought in wars. We've grown up with different life experiences. But in one thing we all share in common, regardless of our background, is that we are all sinners. It is an absolute, regardless of whether you want to think that's true or not. It is not a subjective thing that we can think perhaps we're not. It is an objective reality, as we are all sinners. It is an absolute reality. We are rebels against God. We daily choose to be our own gods. It's something we inherited from Adam and Eve. What did they choose in the garden when the serpent came and said, if you eat of this fruit, you're going to be like God? Friends, we choose that every day. Even as followers of Christ, if you're a follower of Christ in this room, we still at some point in most of our daily lives choose to be like God, choose to be God of our own life. We struggle with that on a daily basis, choosing to say, perhaps I can figure this out better than God can do it. That's the whole reality of rationalization. So we are rebels against God. We place ourselves on the thrones of our lives, supplanting the one true King and rebelling against the kingdom of heaven. We are sinners, and we are in need of the gospel daily. We are in need of the cross, for no matter how long we are on this journey growing closer to Him, it is not complete until we stand face to face with Him. And as we have seen through the encounters of the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sanhedrin throughout this book, is we can be as religious as we want and still miss the point. Religion doesn't get us into heaven. Religion doesn't get us closer to God. Jesus restores the relationship with God. Religion does nothing for us. So if you're here this morning thinking it's about religion, then we've missed the boat. Sorry. If you thought you're coming here to learn about religion, then you're going to be sorely disappointed, because it's not about a religion, it's about a relationship that Christ is resolved to bring us into as we look at John 18 and 19, because we learn that we cannot earn favor with God. It's not about us earning favor. We need the gospel, and we need to understand the truth of the gospel, that God is light. He is holy and perfect, and therefore we are sinful when we don't just do sinful things. But we are sinful and we have a sin nature, and Jesus, being God's Son, has become the one who stands before the Father and speaks on our behalf. He is the one who restores us. It's not us. We can't do enough right things to restore the relationship that we've broken. Man, this is not like going and trying to buy your wife flowers after you completely ruined her favorite vase or her favorite thing at home. Like, you can't do that. There's no amount of chocolate in the world that's going to restore the relationship. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just not going to happen. Christ Himself restores the relationship that's broken for our sin. And as we dive in again this morning, it is my prayer that the Word will convict our hearts and the Spirit will transform us to be more like Him, so that we will be convicted of our sin and allow Him to bring us to the point of repentance. And so this morning we pick up in John chapter 18, verse 28. And there it says, "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, and it was early in the morning. And so they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled." Remember, this was the time of Passover, so they couldn't go into a Gentile's residence. So they did not enter so that they could eat Passover. In verse 29, so Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered him in a sarcastic way, "If this man were not doing evil, would we not have delivered him over to you?" And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." And this was to fulfill the word that Jesus has spoken to show what kind of death he was going to die. So this morning we pick up after the mock trial with the high priest Annas and his son Caiaphas, Caiaphas being a bit of a puppet high priest for the Roman government. And just some background information here. A high priest, when you become a high priest, you're a high priest for life. Well, the Romans didn't like that. They wanted to be in control. Remember, all of Jerusalem, most of Israel has become under Roman control here. So to have a high priest who's high priest for life, well, then you might get a little bit too much control. They want to be in control here. So the Roman government would come in and cut the legs off from under the high priest. So you have Annas, who's the high priest who's been appointed for life, and then you have his son Caiaphas. Well, the Romans come in and say, well, it's Caiaphas' turn to be high priest. You know what I'm saying? So it's his turn. So they limit the power on Annas here. But when we go back, if we're to go back to look earlier in chapter 18, they take him to Annas first because you still recognize as high priest. And then Annas defers to Caiaphas because he's the true high priest in the moment recognized by the government. But then Caiaphas, being a bit of a puppet here, he sends him on to the Romans because he was following the true order. And so this is where we see in John 18 the two high priests, and probably even more, while we see why Caiaphas was willing to hand him over, because he's willing to seek and look for more favor with the Romans. He's willing to try to maintain his position. But look at what Caiaphas says in John 18:14 that kind of sets the whole scene here. If you go back with me in John 18:14, it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Anybody else in the room find that ironic? Caiaphas, the high priest, looking for favor with the Romans because in the culture, if the Jews start causing an uprising, what are the Romans going to do? They don't care. They're going to come in with their swords, they're going to come with their spears and just off with them all. That's kind of the government system here. So Caiaphas says, in all of his puppetry wisdom, it's better that one man die than the Romans get upset, then we have a tussle going on, and they just come in and kill us all. Well, the irony here is that this is exactly what's going to happen, that one man died for the death of many. He did not realize that this is what Jesus has been teaching. We go back to the teachings of Jesus in John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish. One man dying for the many. So Caiaphas sets the scene for what he believes is the physical salvation for the Jewish people from the Romans, when in the grand scheme of things, as high priest, he is setting up the salvation of the people for their sins. He's playing into the hands of God perfectly. Okay, so for a moment, step back here. If we ever question the sovereignty of God in this moment, Caiaphas in John 18:14 is saying it's better than one man die than the Romans come in and destroy us all. It was God's plan all along for Jesus to be crucified. It was God's plan all along for the Jews to witness the crucifixion of Jesus. We go back and read through Judges, all the way through Ezekiel, all the way through the end. This was God's plan. This is where he was directing it. This is what they needed to see their sins on the cross. They needed to see their rebellion. Isaiah chapter 6. With their eyes, they don't see. With their ears, they don't hear. What is the prophecy about? The fact that they're hearing and seeing Jesus, but they're not seeing and they're not hearing Jesus. In Isaiah, this is prophesied, and Isaiah goes on to prophesy, like a lamb, he was led to the slaughter, and he did not open his mouth. And now Caiaphas himself, the high priest who should know the word better than any of us sitting in this room this morning, he should have had the whole thing memorized, be able to speak it out one side and the other. And he's saying it's better that one man should die. Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is scripture. We remember when Abraham takes Isaac up onto the mountain and we see the substitutionary atonement made right there. This is pointing forward to the Christ. This is what this is about. And yet he's missing the point. So here in this moment, we again are reminded of the sovereignty of God. This is not a whimsical thing that, oh, this just happened. No, God is in control. Friends, no matter what's happening in our lives, we need to stop and recognize God is in control. So here in this moment, as we come to Pilate in the early hours of Friday morning, they're probably waking Pilate up. So I don't know how you are when you wake up in the morning. And we set the scene for what's taking place as Pilate comes out to the people. Remember, he comes out because they're not going to enter in, because if they enter in, they're worried about becoming unclean. Again, I'm from Mississippi, so I think this is very ironic. You're going to kill the Son of God, and you're worried about becoming unclean in the moment. Our priorities are a little bit out of whack for the moment. You know what I'm saying? But they weren't getting it. You're more worried about becoming unclean and not being able to take Passover, but you're going to kill God. Okay, that's just Chad's side note here, but that's just my personal opinion. So we set the scene for what's taking place. Pilate comes out to the people. He comes out, and there are gathered the Sanhedrin, which are about 71 men who have judged Jesus to be guilty. Now, these 71 would represent in our day and age probably the Supreme Court, who were likewise appointed for a very long time. And so this is what's happening. They're gathered at the governor's headquarters outside of the walls, and Pilate says, "What accusation do you bring against this man? What's the problem here?" And note the sarcasm. If this man were doing no evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. They don't answer the question. This is like your children. Well, what did you do wrong? Well, what do you think I did wrong? Well, I'm asking you a question. What did you do wrong? Well, I didn't quite do that wrong. Well, you notice they're not answering the question. There's the Supreme Court of the Jewish land here, and they're not answering the question. You think we could get to the point here? And they're saying he's evil, so do something about him. Now, a bit of a background on Pilate. They thought they would have their way with Pilate because he's not known as being a nice, fluffy, kind of cuddly kind of governor here. He's known as being ruthless. He's known as being somebody who goes in and assassinates Jewish people as they're worshiping. He's known as being and going and stealing from the temple treasury, for murdering people. He's known as being his madness. He's known as being mad and his evil tactics. And so the response is, we're bringing you an evil man. Now do it. He's a toy for you. Do as you want. What's so hard about this? It's almost as if they were just throwing a dog a bone or something. But notice, Pilate's not interested in the upheaval. His response is, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to them and to show them what kind of death he was going to die. Now, there's a bit of a twist here. They don't want to deal with him. They want Pilate to handle the dirty work because they didn't want to defile themselves before Passover. They don't want Jesus to be on their hands. Now, we do know that in Acts chapter 6, they stoned Stephen, so they can put someone to death. But here we see again the sovereignty of God, and we go back to John chapter 3, verse 14, where Jesus is again teaching about his own death. In John 3:14, he says, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him will have eternal life. And in John 12:32, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw people to myself. Friends, major point here. No matter how emotional we get about the crucifixion, and I think the farther we go down in this morning, I think it should get our emotions, and I think it should mess with us as a people because this represents our sin. But there's something we need to realize. There's nothing that happens during the week of the Passion. There's nothing that happens from the day that Jesus enters the city with the crowds throwing the palm branches and all this mess. There's nothing that happens when Jesus goes into the upper room and gets on his hands and knees and starts washing the disciples' feet. There's nothing that happens when he goes into the garden and crosses over the valley where all the blood's going to be coming out as they're making the sacrifices. There's nothing that's happening that's a surprise to Jesus. Why? Because he's been teaching about it everywhere that he's been going, that this is what is going to happen. It's not like we get to this moment and it's like, oh, well, I wasn't prepared for that one. He knew It was necessary. It's absolute. And this is what it takes to restore the brokenness that occurred in Genesis. This is what it takes to fulfill the promise made in Genesis 12 to Abraham, that from you will come one who will be a blessing to all nations. This is what it takes to fulfill the promise of Genesis chapter 15. This is what it takes, friends. Remember, the story we tell all of our kids. Noah built an ark, and all the animals went on 2 by 2, and then off came the ark, and we talk about the rainbow, and we talk about the floods, and we paint it on walls, and we think, this is a great story. You realize how awful that story is? It's a story of complete annihilation, but we talk about it like it's just the fluffy, pretty, cuddly story. It's an awful story of annihilation, like awful. Maybe I just get more into it, but at the end of that, he says, never again will I do this on the face of the earth. And you know how he says that? He says, because one is going to come who's going to take all of that wrath on himself. So while we see the wrath of God complete in its fullness, not quite, but almost in its fullness in the flood, and as he destroys everything and all the evil from Genesis chapter 5 through Genesis chapter 9, we see it happening there. The promises and the reality is in the rainbow is that ark is pointed back up. It's an ark. It's not just a bow. It's an ark. And that bow that's pointed back up at him is the wrath of God pointed back up at God himself. And the reality is that the way that we escape that annihilation is because the Son comes to bring restoration for us. And so when we go through this Passion Week, and as we come to these trials, none of it's a surprise. None of it's catching Jesus off guard. It's happening in the perfect way. It's happening in absolute perfection. And so this is not of their own volition, but this is the will and the plan of God. This is the truth that in this moment, this is not that man decided that Jesus would be slain. This is that Jesus has come to offer his life for the restoration and the redemption of the people and the children of God, so that we might be called sons and daughters of the King, so we might be princes and princesses of the kingdom of heaven. That's a big deal. So when we read the gospel accounts, we don't just become emotionally involved. We understand what it takes to redeem us, and we understand that our Father loves us. And nothing inhibits the resolve of the redemption that is taking place. This is why we don't skip any part of the Old Testament in our times of study. For all parts of the Bible are pointing us to redemption and pointing us to the kingdom and pointing us home from the moment of creation through the moment of consummation of the kingdom. It is pointing us to the completion of his work through the King. So friends, notice this in this moment as Caiaphas, as Pilate, and the Sanhedrin are all debating about what is really going on. We should step back and notice that the sovereignty and the glory of God is on full display so that the world may know who is truly king. They're having a debate here, and the king is just standing there. And what we really should understand here is that while they're having a debate, the king is here being the king. He's saying it's already been done. So in verse 33, as we continue this morning, Pilate enters his headquarters again, and he called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about me?" And Pilate answered to him, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and your chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world." And so Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Friends, let's notice the context of what's happening here. The whole thing began outside, perhaps in the portico where everyone is gathered at dawn, and here Pilate calls Jesus inside to have this conversation with him. In verse 33, they move in, and Pilate asks him this very direct question, "Are you the king?" And Jesus evades the question just a bit, and he says, "Did you deduce this on your own, or did they tell you this?" And Pilate again questions, "What have you done that they have delivered you to me?" And Jesus answers this, again reminding us all of the greater significance of all this taking place. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Listen to these words. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. If Jesus, friends, if Jesus were a king of this world, he would have had soldiers, and they would have been going to battle to defend him and defend his position as king. If he were king of this world, as they held him just a few days ago, remember the triumphal entry? If he were king of this world, the triumphal entry, all those people would have taken up arms. This isn't an if-then thing. It was an absolute... In ancient times, they didn't just stand around when somebody came and impeded in your land. You went to war. And today, if somebody impedes on your land, you go to, it still happens. We're kind of territorial about our land. But he says, I'm not about being a king of this world. And we need to go back. If we think that he's just a king of this world, if we think he's just a momentary king, step back with me to Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 and 10. And this is where he's being tempted in the desert. And the devil took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their glory. And Satan says to him, all these things that I will give you if you will just fall down and worship me. And Jesus says, begone, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Friends, if he were just about being a king of this world, in that moment, during all of those temptations, he would have had anything that in this world that he could have wanted. But it wasn't about this world. It wasn't about just momentary affections. It wasn't about just having momentary joy. It wasn't about having momentary fleeting pleasure. It was about understanding the kingdom and having the kingdom of heaven. And the same goes for you and I. We aren't just people of this world. We are people of the kingdom of heaven. We're not just seeking momentary pleasures. We're not just seeking momentary joys. We're not just seeking momentary affection. We're seeking eternal things. If we're just living for the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years or 10 years, then we're missing the boat on what God created us for. Like if we have a 10-year plan, or we have a 30-year plan, or we have a 50-year plan, I'm sorry, but we're missing the boat. God created us for a trillion-year plan, plus infinity. We need to set our eyes and our scope on a trillion plus infinity times years. Our 10-year plan is selling God short. If we set everything on the next 10, well, Pastor, I really think that if we need to work on that funeral and set on the next 10 years because I think that's all the time I have left. Guys, we have infinity plus left. And if we kick the bucket living and running at infinity years, then so be it. We're going to run headlong into heaven. And that's going to be a whole lot of fun. Can you imagine tripping into the arms of God? Like, yes. I mean, can you imagine running so hard and pursuing so hard the work of the kingdom of heaven that you just fall flat and God says, well, I got you on this one. This is good. I mean, shouldn't that be what we're about? That we're pushing it so hard that and he catches us on the other end and we're like, well, that was good. Forget the 10-year plan. Let them handle the details. I mean, that's the kind of funerals I want to be doing. Well, that worked. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what we're supposed to be about, where we're pursuing it. Because that's what Jesus is saying right here in this moment is, I'm a king, yeah. But you don't understand that my kingdom is not here because it's not about fighting things here. It's not about fighting battles here. It's about understanding and pursuing the glory of God. Friends, it is in this moment that this ruthless ruler that Jesus is teaching, that the gospel, the kingdom of heaven, is so much more. He doesn't waste words. Get this, he's talking to Pilate, a murderer, Pilate, a swindler, and he's teaching the gospel. Someone who's going to kill him, and he knows it, and he's teaching the gospel to him. And in John 3:18, this backs up what he's saying here. He's reteaching what he has already said. He says, whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is already condemned because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is judgment. This is judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes into the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out. Get this, the last word in verse 21, carried out in God. So let us come into the light this morning, because this is what he's teaching. He's teaching Pilate, a murderer and a swindler, and in the presence of, with the Sanhedrin and the chief priest standing outside, he says, this is what this is about. This isn't about my murder right now. This isn't about my crucifixion. This is about the kingdom of heaven. This is about the redemption of the world. This is about something far greater here. Because this is about people knowing what it's about. And this important. He says, come into the light. Let your works come into the light so that it may be carried out in God. It's not carried out because of who I am. It's not about my pride. It's not about who people think Chad is. It's not about how people think I'm successful or a failure. It's not about who people think my children are, or whether they think their successes or failures or whatever. It's not about how people think my family's doing. It's about how we are running headlong into the arms of God and saying, whatever. If we fall flat into God on the way there, so be it. It's good. That's what he's demonstrating right here, is that it's about the kingdom and it's about the glory of God that we're seeking, because he's telling Pilate right now is you have the glory of God right in front of you and you're missing it. And so after he says this in verse 38, Pilate went back outside of the Jews and told him, Pilate says to the Jews, I find no guilt in him. But friends, he says, you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Friends, Pilate thought he had found a way out, and it was normal for one of the criminals to be pardoned during the Passover feast. And one of the criminals that was currently in prison awaiting his sentence, which was probably going to be crucifixion, was Barabbas. Surely there was no way the crowd would want a cold-hearted thief. And what we know from Matthew 27, killer, back on the streets. Surely Pilate could show them that while they may not like Jesus as a person, he is much better to have on the streets than a murderer. He knew that they had no legal fight against Jesus. Pilate had come to understand that it was a personal fight, a personal grievance against Jesus, and maybe that personal battle would be squelched with the reality of a freed killer. Think about it. Who do you want on the streets? Somebody who claims to be God, or somebody who is known to kill other people? Is it really a debate here? And the other interesting thing that we find here in this passage is that Pilate's wife, or what we know from the other gospel accounts, has sent a message to him to have nothing to do with what she calls as a righteous man. Now, she wasn't the most righteous person from what we can know from other studies, but she says to Pilate, her husband, have nothing to do with this righteous man, for she has suffered greatly in her dreams. And Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. And now his wife was petitioning him to have nothing to do with Jesus. And Pilate is the only thing standing between Jesus and the cross, and he's trying to find a way out. And so we turn back to the crowd. Pilate has offered to fulfill one of the ceremonial duties of releasing a prisoner during Passover, as showing mercy, as recognizing what God did as he brought his people out of Egypt. And he gives them the option of Barabbas. To Pilate's surprise, when he asked whom they wanted to release, the crowd shouts for Barabbas. Now, can we just stop for a moment and imagine the scene that's taking place? Think about what is going on. You have Pilate standing here in the palace courtyard. Raised above the people standing near him is Jesus in the courtyard above a multitude of people. Remember, the Sanhedrin have probably been gathering people that they're walking through. This is early morning hours on a Friday morning, and they start gathering a crowd to be on their side. The people are here quiet at times, enough for everyone to hear Pilate speak, and Jesus' response, and then loud enough that anyone around them would be able to hear as well. And the reality is that Barabbas is probably confined to the prison in the palace, and he too could hear part of this conversation. So you imagine this scene. You have Pilate up high with Jesus, the people down below with the growing multitude of people there, and Barabbas over here in the prison in the dungeon, hearing part of the conversation, knowing that he was doomed to be crucified. So we got the scene. Pilate, the people, Barabbas over here. For some reason in Barabbas' mind, there was a massive crowd gathered in the palace during the Passover. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't have the context of all this happening. And now Barabbas was a bad dude. But even in this condition, he was probably fearful of what's happening. As far as we know, he was a harsh criminal. And he was awaiting sentence soon. The crowds get quiet. And Barabbas is left to wonder what's going on. That all of a sudden the crowd screams, "Let him be crucified. Let him be crucified." And Pilate asks, "Do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas?" And they scream, "Barabbas." Put yourself in that prison for a moment. You hear, "Let him be crucified," and then you hear the name Barabbas being hurled by the people. The soldiers then come down to the prison and they get him. In his mind, he knows what awaits, and he is sure that this would be the last time that he would ever walk again as they lead him out to be crucified. The anguish of what would be going through his mind, what he would be thinking about. All he knew is there was an angry mob, for some reason, during Passover, and here was a dead man walking. They get to the top of the prison steps and they let him go. They don't beat him, they don't flog him, they don't strap him to a cross piece. They just shout, "Crucify him, crucify him." He was a murderer and he was a thief and he deserved the cross and he was free. Barabbas is free. And as we're going to read next week, Jesus was beaten. Barabbas was a killer. Jesus was a healer. Barabbas was a thief. Jesus fed thousands and gave freely. Barabbas was mean and represented evil. Jesus was kind and represented love. Yet on that day, Barabbas was set free and Jesus was beaten. On that day, Jesus would be crucified while Barabbas would get another chance. Pilate, knowing that Jesus was innocent, washes his hand before the crowds and declares that he is innocent of Jesus' blood. And the crowd takes responsibility, wanting only that Jesus is killed. Friends, when we look at this part of the journey of Jesus, we must find ourselves in the same place that Barabbas did. We look at our lives, and you and I have one thing in common. We are all sinners. We are all sinners. We are all murderers, if only in our minds. We are all adulterers, if only in our minds. We are all thieves. We are all evil. Before God, without any question of doubt, we are guilty. We recognize our sin, but just like Barabbas on the day before, Pilate released Jesus has substituted himself for all of our guilt, for all of our sin. When we look towards eternity and when the night comes, Jesus calls us home. And the reality is that every human being that has ever lived only deserves to die. Only deserves to die. Every person without question deserves death. But the truth is that for those whom God has called his children, he has delivered grace. We read in Romans chapter 5 that from one man came death, and that from another man came the fullness of righteousness for all. Judgment has been carried out. Remember in John 17 where we read that as he fervently prayed that there be, let us be one as he is one. As we read earlier last week in John chapter 18, as Peter takes out his sword and cuts off Malchus's ear, he says, "Did I not come to take this cup?" The cup that was poured out on Jesus on the cross contained the wrath for our sins. We look at this story of a killer named Barabbas, and perhaps we would scream out and say, that's injustice. That's unfair. That's not right. But before we scream and before we get too upset, friends, we need to realize that's the truth. That's how you and I are redeemed. But we say Barabbas deserved to die. So did we. Barabbas deserved prison. So do we. Grace is often a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around because we are such a cause and effect type of people. Our sin deserves death, but with Christ we are welcomed into life. That's the truth of grace. It is this reason that drives us to go to the place where there are, and to pray for a place where there are people being killed and persecuted for their faith, like Somalia this morning, where death is not the abnormal, but the norm. It is this reality that our life has already been paid for. It is this reason that we don't have a 10-year or a 15-year or a 20-year plan, but we run headlong into whatever this life has for us, knowing that it's not about this life, it's about us understanding the gospel of the kingdom, and as long as we are part of the kingdom, that we're not marked by a dash on a tombstone or by a date on a tombstone, but we're marked by an eternal life that has begun and it will continue as long as we are part of the children of God. And one thing we can know is that our eternity is secure in Him, through Him, because He has made it secure. And so we press on. Friends, this morning, we are the Barabbas in this story. Or we are the Pilate in this story, who are ignoring religion altogether, saying, I just want nothing to do with it. Just move on. I'm too busy. I don't have enough time. It's just religion to me. It's all just religion and everybody has their own way. One way or another, we're playing ourselves into one of these two characters. The absolute truth is none of us are Jesus. Even though that's the place we want to put ourselves, we want to be God, none of us are Jesus. We're either Pilate saying, it's all religion to me and we're just going to wash our hands of it, or we're Barabbas accepting the grace. Because we're all murderers, sinners, thieves, and broken. Where are we in this morning? Where are we in our lives? Friends, I implore us all to look at how we do life, how we examine who God has created us to be, how He's created us to live. If you're not a believer here this morning, hear the message of the gospel, that through Him we have been restored. If we are part of the family of God this morning, hear the message of the gospel. No matter how young you are, the greatest hope that we have is that we're going to run headlong into God. And we're going to cry, holy, 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 and it's going to be good. And nothing that we can know or study or examine about heaven is going to live up to the expectations and the glory that we're going to walk into when it's done. Nothing is going to live up to those expectations. And the reality that we're going to find ourselves in. No matter how young we are, let that be our pursuit this morning. Let that be our pursuit for the next 10, 20, 30, 80 years. Because then eternity will be even sweeter. Because it'll be all that we expect and more and more. This morning, let us find ourselves in the light doing the work of God. Let's pray together.